There are 50 states in this country. Not one was built to function without electricity, not one, but some are dramatically less prepared than others. Some have hidden fragilities baked into the way they get water, food, medicine, and heat. Fragilities invisible on a sunny day and impossible to ignore on a dark one. And if the grid ever falls in a way that is not coming back in days or weeks, but in months or longer, those states do not collapse evenly. They collapse in order. Today, I'm going to walk you through the 7 states that researchers, engineers, and emergency planners consistently rank as the most vulnerable. The states that, in a long-term grid failure, vanish first. This is not opinion. This is not a doom forecast. The criteria are concrete. Grid isolation, water dependency, population density per acre of farmland within driving distance, climate extremes that turn fragile within hours of losing power, medical fragility of the population, distance from rail terminals, refineries, and ports. Some of these states will surprise you. One of them is where I live, and watching it fail in slow motion over the last 15 years is part of why I started this channel. Before I name the states, I want to be clear about one thing. This is not a video about evacuation. The roads do not handle that volume of cars under any scenario. The question is not where you go. The question is what your state is structurally capable of providing, and what it is not when the lights stop coming back on. Stay with me to the end. The complete documentation referenced throughout this video is linked in the description below. It contains the same engineering frameworks I'm using to rank these states, the same charts, the same data on aquifer drawdown rates, transformer replacement timelines, and population density per acre of arable land. Read it free for 7 days. If it is not the most useful document you have read this year, you get your money back, no questions, no friction. Now, let us talk about why the grid falling forever is not a fringe scenario anymore. The North American power grid is not one grid, it is 3. The Eastern Interconnection, the Western Interconnection, and ERCOT, the Texas grid, which is essentially its own island. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has flagged for years that the system is operating with thinner margins than at any point since deregulation in the late 90s. The average transformer in service today was installed during the Reagan administration. Many of them are operating decades past their original design lifetime, propped up with maintenance schedules that assume a normal supply chain for replacement parts. Most of those parts are not manufactured in this country anymore. The large power transformers that step voltage up and down between transmission and distribution are built primarily in South Korea, Mexico, and a handful of European facilities. Lead times for replacement in a normal year run between 12 and 24 months. In a year where a meaningful fraction of the fleet needs replacement at once, the math does not close. That is the part nobody puts on the news. The grid does not fail because of one bad day. It fails because the equipment underneath it is older than most of the people watching this video, and the supply chain to replace that equipment was outsourced 30 years ago to countries that have their own problems and their own queues. Add cyber attack risk, add geomagnetic disturbance from solar activity. Add the simple reality that named storms hitting the Gulf Coast have roughly doubled since the 1970s. The grid is fine on a Tuesday. It is finished by a bad month. Let me tell you a quick story. James is 51, lives in Houston, Texas, mechanical engineer, 24 years in oil and gas. He's married, 3 kids. His mother-in-law moved in 2 years ago. She has type 1 diabetes. Her insulin needs to stay cold. In February 2021, Storm Uri shut down the Texas grid. 3 days no power. The temperature in his house dropped into the 40s. His mother-in-law's insulin was stored in a cooler with what was left of the freezer ice. By day 2, the ice was melting. By the morning of day 3, James was driving to a gas station 40 miles away that had power just to keep his mother-in-law's medication viable. That was the moment. Not the cold, not the dark, the 40-mile drive to keep insulin alive. A friend at the office, also an engineer, sent him the documentation about a year later. James read the section on nickel-iron chemistry first. He had heard of Edison batteries in college, but had never looked at them seriously. The documentation laid out the case. Patent from 1901. Cells that have been operating for over a century. Resistance to freezing. Resistance to overdischarge. The chemistry that, on paper, never dies. He spent 6 months building a small backup bank, off-grid, sized for critical loads only. The freezer for insulin, a small medical fridge, some LED lights, nothing fancy. Last year, a transformer blew on his street. Power was out for 19 hours. James didn't drive to a gas station. His mother-in-law didn't ask him about her insulin. The complete documentation costs less than what a single emergency generator service call would cost during a Texas freeze. 7 days money-back guarantee. Link in the description. When the grid fails, knowledge doesn't. Back to the video, continuing. That story is the bridge into state number 1. Because James lives in the state I'm about to name first. State number 1, Texas. Texas is the only state in the lower 48 that runs its own electrical grid. ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, was designed in the 1970s specifically to avoid federal regulation. The trade-off was independence. The cost was that, when ERCOT fails, no neighboring state can rescue it through the regional interconnection system the rest of the country relies on. Storm Uri in February 2021 killed at least 246 people in Texas, according to the state health department. Some independent analyses put the real number above 700. Power was out for days. Water systems failed. Pipes burst in homes that had no insulation against a hard freeze. That was a 4-day event. Texas survived because the rest of the country was still functional. Trucks could still move. Hospitals in other states could still take patients. Help was still possible. Now imagine the grid does not come back in 4 days. Imagine it does not come back at all. Texas has roughly 30 million people. Most of them are clustered in 5 major cities, all of which depend on long-distance water pipelines from increasingly stressed reservoirs. Houston, where James lives, sits at sea level in hurricane country. Dallas and Austin sit on aquifers that are dropping every year. The state has agricultural capacity, on paper, but that capacity assumes diesel for tractors, working irrigation pumps, refrigerated trucks, and a functional supply chain to move grain from field to mill to grocery store. Strip the electricity, and most of that capacity becomes inaccessible within weeks. This is why Texas is on the list, not because Texans are unprepared. Many are. It is because Texas built itself a beautiful, isolated, self-contained electrical system that is impressive when it works and catastrophic when it does not. State number 2, California. California has the largest population in the country. It also has the most complex water and electricity infrastructure in the country. Both of those facts make it fragile. Most Californians do not live where the water is. The Los Angeles Basin, where roughly 18 million people reside, depends on water pumped over mountain ranges from the Colorado River, the Sierra Nevada, and Northern California. Every gallon of that water requires electricity to pump. No power, no water in Los Angeles. The state has spent the last decade learning to turn off its own grid in advance of wildfires. Public safety power shutoffs. Pacific Gas and Electric, the largest utility in the state, has cut power to hundreds of thousands of customers at a time during fire weather. The infrastructure is genuinely too brittle to leave energized in dry wind. That is the rehearsal. That is what California looks like in a controlled grid down event with help still on the way. A permanent failure removes the help. The Sierra Snowpack does not deliver itself to a faucet in Burbank. The almonds in the Central Valley do not harvest themselves without diesel. The desalination plants along the coast, what few exist, run on electricity. California also has the highest concentration of medically fragile residents in the country who depend on home medical equipment. Oxygen concentrators, dialysis machines, CPAP devices, refrigerated medication. Every one of those devices is a power outlet looking for a wall that can no longer power it. State number 3, Florida. Florida has the second highest percentage of residents over the age of 65 in the country. Roughly 1 in 5 Floridians is a senior. Many of them live in retirement communities concentrated along the coast. The state averages between 7 and 10 named storms per Atlantic hurricane season. Most years, at least one makes landfall on the peninsula. The grid is repeatedly damaged and repeatedly restored, in part because the rest of the country sends crews and equipment after each storm. That model only works if the rest of the country can still send crews. In a long-term failure, the convoy of utility trucks driving in from Georgia and the Carolinas does not arrive. Florida sits at low elevation. The aquifer that supplies most of the state with drinking water sits beneath the surface, vulnerable to saltwater intrusion if the pumps that keep it pressurized stop running. The Everglades, which buffers South Florida from storm surge, is itself maintained by an electrically powered water management system that has been called one of the largest engineered hydrological projects on the planet. Add to that the medical reality. A viewer from Sarasota wrote in last year. Eleanor, 67, retired teacher, has lived through Andrew, Charlie, Wilma, Irma, and Ian. When she finished reading the documentation, she told her daughter that 90% of what was in there was what her mother had taught her growing up in rural Georgia. The other 10% was the engineering she could not have learned at her mother's table. Florida ranks third on this list because the state has the infrastructure of a developed nation, the climate of a tropical archipelago, and the demographics of a retirement village. 3 pressures, 1 grid. State number 4, Arizona. Phoenix routinely sees summer temperatures above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. In 2023, the city recorded 31 consecutive days at or above that threshold. Air conditioning is not a luxury in Phoenix. It is medical infrastructure. The Maricopa County Department of Public Health attributes hundreds of deaths each year to heat exposure. Most of those deaths happen in homes where the air conditioning either failed or was never installed. In a grid-down summer, that number becomes catastrophic in a way most Americans cannot mentally rehearse. Arizona has roughly 7 million people. The Phoenix metropolitan area holds nearly 5 million of them. The water supply comes primarily from the Colorado River through the Central Arizona Project, a 336-mile aqueduct that lifts water nearly 3,000 feet using 14 pumping stations. Every one of those stations is electrically powered. No electricity, no water in Phoenix, no air conditioning, no Phoenix. The food supply is similarly thin. Arizona produces some leafy greens and citrus, but the bulk of the food consumed in Phoenix arrives by refrigerated truck from California's Central Valley, from Mexico, and from the rail terminals in Tucson. Strip out diesel and electricity, and the shelves empty within a week. State number 5, Nevada. Nevada is what happens when you build cities in the desert without thinking about what would happen if the systems failed. Las Vegas exists because of the Hoover Dam, which is to say, it exists because of one specific piece of mid-20th century engineering and the lake behind it. Lake Mead has been at historic lows for years. The intake straws that pull water for Las Vegas have already been redesigned twice to reach lower water. Every gallon that arrives at a faucet on the Strip required electricity to pump and treat. Las Vegas has roughly 2.25 million residents in its metropolitan area. The state produces almost no food. There is no significant agriculture, no functioning rail freight network of any size compared to the population, no refinery, no port, and no nearby coastal supply alternative. What Nevada has, structurally, is hospitality and casinos. Both are powered industries. None of those workers can grow wheat in a parking lot. A state with 2 million urban residents, no farmland of consequence, and complete dependency on long-distance electricity, water, and food shipments is, by any honest definition, the most fragile of the desert-urban experiments in this country. State number 6, New York. New York City is, by some metrics, the most densely populated city in the United States. Manhattan alone holds roughly 70,000 people per square mile. There is no land within the city for meaningful food production. None. The water supply is gravity-fed from upstate reservoirs, which is genuinely good news. New York City can deliver water without electricity for a remarkable distance into a grid down event. That is not the problem. The problem is everything else. The city imports nearly all of its food, nearly all of its fuel, and nearly all of its medicine through a small number of choke points. The Hudson tunnels, the bridges, the Port of New York and New Jersey, the cold storage warehouses in northern New Jersey that supply the bodegas and the supermarkets. Every one of those choke points is fragile. Everyone becomes uncrossable in a long grid down a vent. Tunnels flood without pumps. Bridges close without traffic management. Ports cease to function without cranes that need electricity. A viewer from Brooklyn, Daniel, 36, software engineer, survived Hurricane Sandy in 2012 and the COVID supply chain shock of 2020. He told me once that the moment he understood the city's fragility was not Sandy. It was the second week of March 2020 when the grocery shelves and Park Slope stayed empty even though the trucks were technically still running. State number 7, Louisiana. Louisiana sits at the bottom of the country in two senses. Geographically, much of it is at or below sea level. The pumps that keep New Orleans dry run on electricity 24 hours a day, every day, for as long as the city exists. Without them, the city floods within weeks, regardless of weather. Industrially, Louisiana sits at the bottom of the Mississippi River, where roughly 40% of all American agricultural exports pass through the port complex around New Orleans and Baton Rouge. The state also hosts the largest concentration of refineries in the country along the Gulf Coast corridor. A grid down event in Louisiana cascades. The pumps fail, the refineries shut down. The Mississippi shipping channels become unmanageable without working locks and dredging equipment. The agricultural export pipeline that feeds a meaningful percentage of the world chokes off at its origin. Hurricane Ida in 2021 knocked out power to over 1 million Louisianans. Some areas waited weeks for restoration. The state survived because, again, the rest of the country was still functional. Louisiana ranks 7th on this list, and some emergency planners would put it higher because the state combines geographic fragility, industrial concentration, hurricane exposure, and a population that is poorer on average than most of the country, which translates directly into less private capacity to absorb a long-term outage. If you're watching from one of those 7 states, leave the name of your state in the comments. I rate every one of them, and the geographic distribution of where this channel's viewers actually live shapes which deep dives I do next. Texas, California, Florida, Arizona, Nevada, New York, Louisiana. If you are in any of them, your comment is the most useful data I get this week. Now, the question I get every time I do a list like this is, what about the safer states? What about the ones that survive longest? The honest answer is that no state survives a permanent grid failure indefinitely. The country was built on the assumption of electricity. What varies is the rate of collapse. Vermont survives longer than Nevada because Vermont has water, fuel, agriculture, and a population already living partially off-grid. Idaho survives longer than Florida because Idaho is colder, less populated, and closer to its food than Florida is to its medicine. But these are differences of months, not differences of forever. Every state in this country needs the documentation to be able to function at the household level when the larger system stops underwriting daily life. If you are not yet subscribed, this is the channel where the analysis goes deeper than the headline. Subscribe so the next breakdown lands in your feed before the next storm makes the conversation urgent. The grid is not going to fall tomorrow, but it has been falling in slow motion for 30 years. The states on this list are the ones where that slow fall has the shortest distance left to drop. When the grid fails, knowledge doesn't.